You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. Our shopping behavior has changed a lot over the past few years. During the pandemic, people who could worked from home, and online shopping became a go-to. E-commerce and tech expanded rapidly to keep up. Last year, when many of those same customers returned to the office, they gave up their subscriptions to streaming services, started returning to their offline lives. Now, the demand for digital products and services is waning. Amid declining sales, the squeeze of inflation, and hikes in interest rates, companies like Amazon, Meta, Microsoft, and Gap have announced major layoffs. But hidden behind the numbers is a story of an international workforce.
Last year, data from the Economic Policy Institute shows those same companies have laid off 85,000 workers in 2022 and early 2023. The minute a foreign worker on an H1B visa loses his or her job, they've got 60 days, just 60 days to find a new opportunity or risk getting deported and separated from their family. And that is creating a sense.
What happens to tech workers on international visas when there are sharp and sudden shifts in demand for labor?
Foreign-born workers, especially in tech, have played an outsized role in shaping Silicon Valley and the broader tech industry in the U.S. today.
That's Pranav Dixit, a reporter for Buzzfeed who covers tech and Silicon Valley. While in India, Dixit got his start writing about tech's massive influence on his country's 1.4 billion residents. But when he moved to Silicon Valley, he saw firsthand the outsized impact of immigrants from Southeast Asia on the U.S. tech sector.
I'm from India, and traditionally studying math and science has just been like the default in my country. As soon as you graduate from high school, you study science. It's just, you don't study anything else. It's either science or medicine, right? Those are considered like the two professions that are most lucrative. I believe it's the same in China. And in the United States, traditionally, there has not been that much focus on children studying STEM, children studying science and engineering and mathematics to the degree that it has been in South Asia and China. And so there has always been a lot of demand from the US tech industry for engineers. And there haven't been enough people in the US to meet that demand. And which is why Silicon Valley tech companies have looked to India and China, and which is why the H1B visa is so popular.
Immigrants from India make up nearly 1/3 of foreign-born workers in fields like healthcare and tech in the U.S., and they play a huge role in shaping innovation and the U.S. economy.
People from South Asia who dominate Silicon Valley at all levels, there are engineers who work at Silicon Valley tech companies, but the companies themselves, which are the biggest companies in the world, and which also happen to be American companies, are all headed by South Asian CEOs, right? The CEO of Alphabet, Sundar Pichai, is from India. The CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, is from India. CEO of Adobe, which makes Photoshop, Shantanu Narayan, is from India. It's not a tech company, but the CEO of Starbucks is from India. And so Indians are some of the highest paid immigrant groups in the US because of this. And it's quite extraordinary that they are all on visas and all of it can be taken away from them at any point.
Many foreign engineers and doctors rely upon H1B visas to come here. But the program has major caveats. So what uncertainty awaits these workers who've been laid off by Amazon, Facebook, and other tech companies? For more, we go to Pranav Dixit. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, the jobless rate was soaring in the early pandemic, Pranav. What was happening in the job market in the tech sector at the same time?
So over the last 2 years, as we all moved online, there was a surge in people using online products and services over the last 2 years because of the pandemic. And what that meant was companies started hiring a lot to meet this additional demand. And over the last couple of years, companies thought that these trends were here to stay. But unfortunately, as we go back to normal, more or less, all the online activity is back at pre-pandemic levels now. And so that's a big reason why companies are laying off people, because they realize that maybe they overhired during the last couple of years.
Did the big familiar companies, household names really, along with lots of smaller ones, look overseas for new workers?
So, American tech companies have traditionally hired a lot of people from overseas, especially from India and China, not just during the pandemic. This has been happening for the past few decades. And the most common work visa that most tech employees are on in the US is called the H1B. Only 85,000 H1B visas are given out annually through a lottery system. And the H1B visa typically lasts for about 3 years with a possible extension of another 3. And there's lots of data that shows that some of the biggest American tech companies, Meta, Amazon, Twitter, Lyft, Salesforce, hired at least 45,000 workers on H1B visas over the last 3 years.
Well, that's good for those workers, aspiring engineers, programmers, designers. What happens if you lose that job, the job that one particular employer sponsored you for, and you travel to the United States to take?
Right. So the H1B is tied to your employer. Typically, an employer has to sponsor your visa, which means that you cannot work for any other employer unless your new employer takes over your existing H1B visa, which is typically a process that's called a transfer and takes a couple of months at least to happen. If you're laid off from your current job and if you're on an H1B visa, because the visa is tied to your employer, it's no longer valid if you don't have a job anymore. And so you have 60 days to find a new job if you're laid off with another employer who would sponsor your H1B. If you can't find a job within 60 days, you basically have to leave the country, no matter how long you've been here.
Now, you mentioned that it takes some time to complete that transfer. Is the system flexible so that if you find a job late in your 60-day window, the clock kind of stops until you can do the necessary paperwork, make the necessary legal arrangements to start with that new employer?
Right. I'm not a lawyer. So as far as I know, as long as a new company applies for your visa to be transferred to them within the 60-day window, you should be good. You don't have to complete the transfer process within those 60 days. You just have to get another company to put in the application for the transfer within those 60 days. But 60 days in this economy, that's a pretty tight window to find a new job, especially when there have been thousands and thousands of layoffs and you have all your coworkers essentially competing for the same jobs that you're competing for. And so even in a situation when the economy is doing well, which it does not right now, 60 days is a pretty tight time frame to find a new job.
So we can assume, I guess, that some useful, talented, now experienced workers in California have had the rug pulled out. Are there people heading home? Do you know?
Yes, absolutely. I've had conversations in the course of my reporting with a lot of people who are really using this moment to reassess their relationship with the US. A lot of them came here many, many years ago and have families and houses and partners and kids going to school in the US and find themselves in a situation now where they suddenly have to pack their bags and leave the country if they can't find anything in 60 days. The reason why this is so brutal is also tied to how permanent residency in the US works. So I spoke about how the H1B is valid for 3 years with a possible extension of another 3 years. So overall, you can be here on an H1B visa for 6 years. Within those 6 years, if your employer doesn't apply for permanent residency, which is often known as a green card for you, you have to leave at the end of those 6 years. Most tech workers especially the ones born in China and India, who work at Silicon Valley tech companies, are able to stay beyond those 6 years of an H1B in the US because they are in line for a permanent residency. As long as you're in the line, you can stay in the country indefinitely. And the reason why you can be in line for multiple decades at this point, if you are a person who's born in India or China, is because there's enormous backlogs in those lines. And so if you're in line, it means that you haven't got your green card yet. And if you lose your job, it means you still have to go back if you can't find something else within 60 days.
I wonder whether once they end up back in Taipei, Chengdu, Bangalore, whether they actually aspire to come back to the United States. Are there people who end up sort of on a circuit back and forth? Or does the United States risk permanently losing some of this talent? You talked about that reassessment.
Yes, I think the last 10 years have been really good for the tech industry in the US. We haven't seen layoffs at this scale. We haven't seen any downturns, really. It's been boom time for Facebook and Google and Apple and Salesforce and all these companies. And I think there hasn't been a big reason for foreign-born workers in the US to really think about leaving the country until this point. And I think because of this, the US is losing some talent, perhaps permanently, perhaps in the future, they might come back. Based on my conversations with people in the course of my reporting so far, though, a lot of people are thinking, is it really worth staying in the country when I can go back to India or China and live a fairly comfortable life? Remote working is now pretty normal after the pandemic. A lot of people are now realizing that they can perhaps live in India and still work from India for the same US companies that they used to work for, and they don't actually have to be here. And so I think people are really, really using this time to reevaluate what their priorities are and what their relationship is with both the US and their own country in many cases.
Should anybody have been surprised? I mean, given the hiring spree these companies went on as people moved to remote work, started ordering goods at home, as you mentioned, meals at home, doing banking from home, which put a lot of people in tech to work. There was going to be a return to normal, or at least normal-ish. Wasn't that always going to carry the risk of contraction, of layoffs, of a reexamination of workforce size at some of these, even the big profitable companies?
Yeah, you would think so. It seems pretty obvious in hindsight now that we're hopefully on the other side of this pandemic. But it doesn't seem like the companies in question thought that. They thought that these trends were here to stay. In fact, Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg said as much in his letter to Meta employees announcing the layoffs. Meta laid off more than 11,000 employees last year. And Zuckerberg said, we thought these trends were here to stay, but unfortunately, they're not. And he took responsibility for it. So in hindsight, it seems obvious that, hey, things were going to go back to normal, but it seems that the tech companies really misjudged that.
How long will it take? What will you be watching for to figure out whether this is a hiccup, a broad, long-term retrenchment, or, as we've been discussing, the inevitable bump that comes with the ups and downs in the business cycle? What should we be looking for to understand the scope of these setbacks?
I think there is a realization now, after 10 years of sort of almost a reckless kind of growth, that companies need to grow sustainably, need to focus more on making profits and not just throw money at a wall and see what sticks, which is kind of what has been happening in Silicon Valley for many, many years now. Startups especially, are finding it very hard to raise venture capital. The funding is dried up. There's a lot of focus on companies growing sustainably and also making profits, not hiring recklessly, not spending money recklessly. I think we're going to see companies being more realistic in how they hire and what they aim to achieve.
Well, there are often winners in cases like this. Will companies that are starting up in a much lower cost environment in Canada, in China, in Taiwan, be the beneficiary of the market now suddenly awash in international talent that's looking for a gig?
Yeah, absolutely. And not just companies outside the US, there's a lot of startups in the US that are suddenly awash with applications from candidates who formerly used to work at big tech companies. And they are very happy about it because they haven't had a chance to hire somebody from Google before or somebody from Meta before. And now they can, just because thousands of those people need jobs. So I think it's not just startups in other countries. It's also a lot of smaller companies, not the big tech companies, but a lot of companies that, are not household names, even in the US, that are very excited by the opportunity to be able to potentially hire somebody who worked at a big tech company before.
Are the next Silicon Valleys benefited by this? The Austins, the Salt Lake Cities, places that have aspirations in this regard, but and are home to a lot of startups, as you mentioned. Does this help them?
I think it does, but when it comes to hiring people on visas, it's the same story whether you're in Silicon Valley or whether you're in Austin. It doesn't really help anybody who needs a visa to stay in the US, right?
Let's talk a little bit more about the H1Bs. There have been complaints about them for years. The companies that use them heavily were accused of being able to hire talent at lower rates, disadvantaging American educated engineers and designers, disadvantaging American born computer science graduates coming out of the big programs from around the country. There was also a complaint that it was a kind of indentured servitude, that it gave companies too much power once you were already in the country because of that requirement that they hold the visa, and now suddenly you had to scramble if they laid you off. Is any of this getting a second look as a result of this change in the marketplace?
Yeah, I think there have certainly been critics of the H1B visa system within the US. There have been lots of people in the US who do claim that the H1B visas makes it harder for Americans to get jobs. And those voices have certainly become louder in the wake of all these layoffs in the tech industry. I think it's important to remember, though, that a lot of the claims that the critics make, such as, oh, it enables tech companies to hire people and pay them low wages, are not true. The H1B is a visa that's only offered for like specialty occupations. Usually, specialty occupations include computer science, where American representation has historically been low. Americans typically do not study STEM, which stands for science, tech, engineering, math, as much as people from South Asia and China have historically studied. And so I don't think there's any merit to the allegation that the H1B lets companies hire people and pay them low wages versus paying American workers a higher wage, because you do have certain minimums that the H1B requires companies to pay employees that they hire on this visa. It is true, however, that when a company sponsors an H1B visa, they do hold all the strings. It can be used as a tool to exploit anybody who holds that visa, because the company that sponsors your visa has the keys to your entire future in their hands. Often, H1B employees don't speak up against workplace abuse or unfair treatment. They hesitate to ask for promotions. They don't want to make their managers angry. Just because your visa, if the company decides that it doesn't want to sponsor you anymore, it's goodbye. You have to find a job in 60 days or leave the country. And so it is true that the H1B visa is sort of an indentured servitude in many cases. It gives the company that sponsors you a lot of leverage against you, and it gives you almost no leverage against them.
Pranav, in 2023, What will you be looking for on your beat to get an idea of where the industry is moving, even at this time of big layoffs and retrenchment?
I'm going to have my eye on artificial intelligence. I think in 2022, we saw an explosion of AI. Just in the last 6 months, we saw ChatGPT and DALL-E, which are essentially applications that can generate images or text with a simple text prompt. I think it's the first time that AI of any sort has gone mainstream at this scale. Even normal people know what ChatGPT is, what DALL-E is. I think we saw that in the second half of 2022, and it's only going to accelerate in 2023. That's what I'm going to be keeping an eye on. That's what a lot of tech reporters are keeping an eye on, about how AI is going to change our world in so many industries. And I think it's going to be an exciting space to watch.
Well, if machine learning makes its hoped-for advances, you'll already have a way of knowing what I'm going to ask you in advance. So this will be easier the next time.
It will be. You won't even need me the next time. You can just plug these questions into ChatGPT or something, and it'll spit out the answers, and maybe it'll even spit out the answers in my voice. Who knows?
Pranav Dixit is with us. He covers the tech sector for Buzzfeed. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by Commonwealth Club World Affairs in San Francisco. After the break, what happened to Pranav Dixit after the shutdown of Buzzfeed News, his visa journey since being laid off, and the ticking clock to stay in the U.S. If you missed any part of this episode or want to catch up on other international stories, download our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. The last time journalist Pranav Dixit was on the program, he talked about his beat. He covers the tech business from Silicon Valley. At that time, for Buzzfeed News, Dixit came to the U.S. from India, where he had covered his home country's burgeoning tech sector. When Dixit joined us, tech giants were announcing giant layoffs, one after another. Thousands of immigrant workers drawn to California were finding themselves out of work, sometimes with little support and backup from the companies that brought them to the U.S. Then, Buzzfeed News closed operations, and Pranav Dixit became, in a way, one of the people he used to cover. A revealing and uncomfortable moment for any reporter. Pranav Dixit, welcome back to On Shifting Ground.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Remind us how you came to the United States in the first place.
I call myself an accidental expat. I came to the US for a fellowship. I was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard in 2021 through May 2022. And that's how I came to the US to begin with. And halfway through my fellowship, BuzzFeed News, which was my previous employer who I had been working with from India for 6 years at that point, offered to move me to the US to cover Silicon Valley from Silicon Valley instead of covering it from India once the fellowship wrapped up. And they did my visa. And after the fellowship wrapped up, I moved to the San Francisco Bay Area to work as a Silicon Valley tech reporter instead of an India tech reporter.
So what were the terms under which you were living in the United States at that point? And were you figuring on making this a permanent change?
So when I came here for the fellowship, I moved here very much with no intention of actually staying on after the fellowship. The fellowship was supposed to last for 10 months from August to May. And then the idea was always to just go back to my job because I was on an official sabbatical from work. And so I came here with 4 suitcases with no intention of staying here long term. And so this opportunity where BuzzFeed offered to relocate me just fell into my lap. And I decided to grab it because not that many journalists from India get a chance to just move to a new country and still continue to be in journalism. So the terms that I came to the US, I was on something called a J visa, which is a visa that you get if you're like a researcher or a scholar or in academia. Harvard did that for me because they ran the fellowship. And so I came to the US as a research scholar on something called a J1 visa. And BuzzFeed did something called an O visa, which is officially defined as the talent visa. It's given to individuals with extraordinary ability or achievements. Not my words, that's how the USCIS puts it. And so BuzzFeed worked with me to get me an O. And when I started working for BuzzFeed in the US, that was the visa that I was on.
And here you are in the Bay Area, working away for a couple of years, unexpectedly, accidental expat, as you say. Were you getting used to being here, let's say? Were you starting to envision a long-term life in the United States? And would that have required at some point an adjustment in your status?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know about living here permanently, but I certainly wasn't thinking of going back to India in the short term. I thought, I'm going to give it a few years. I'm going to find my feet here. I'm going to see what doors this may open, what chances I may get, see where my career goes. And then who knows, maybe I'll go back or maybe I'll move to a different country. I didn't really come here thinking that, oh, this is it. I'm going to stay here permanently now.
When you appeared on Shifting Ground, you talked about the particular cases of people who were in the country on H1B visas and about their challenges of finding new employment while the clock was ticking for them to leave the country after the employers that brought them to the United States let them go. There you were covering the precarity, let's say, of their existence. Were you relating it to yourself at all?
Yeah, I certainly didn't expect to be in the same boat a few short months after I was covering the stories of other immigrants who had been laid off while they were on visas in the US. And so that was quite a shock. And I felt like the rug had been pulled from under my feet. And I certainly related to anybody who happens to be in the US on a work visa. It's a precarious existence because if you're on a visa, your sort of entire existence in the US is determined by your status. The visa dictates so much of your life here in the US. It dictates what you can do and what you can't do. It dictates how long you can stay in the country. You're always living with this sword hanging over your head about, oh my God, am I going to get a renewal? What happens if I lose my job? I don't have a lot of time to find new employment because if you can't find a job and if you're on a visa within a certain time frame, you have to leave the country and sort of uproot your whole existence that you've worked very hard to build in this country. And so I certainly went through all those stages of grief and anger and fear and anxiety when BuzzFeed News shut down.
Well, like an H-1B visa, one of the consistent critiques of the H-1B is that it sort of binds you to the employer that brings you to the United States. And if that job that you came for ceases to exist, your status as an H-1B worker evaporates at the same time. Is that the case with the O visa that you were here on as well?
Yeah, so with the O, it's a little more complicated. There's two ways that you can file an O, which you can't do with an H1B. So in my case, BuzzFeed News had filed my O, which meant that they were my petitioner. And that meant that I could only work for them. Much in the same way that anybody on an H1B is tied to their employer, I was tied to BuzzFeed News in that case. Even though I was on an O, the only difference I would say between the H1B and the O, an employer-sponsored O, as it was in my case, is that the O isn't subject to a lottery. The H1B, you have to go through a lottery. There's only 85,000 H1Bs that the US gives out every year, and they get hundreds of thousands of applications for those 85,000 slots. So literally your career, even if an employer decides to sponsor your H1B, it's not up to your employer, because if you don't make it through the lottery, then you don't get it. The O is not subject to a lottery. If you meet certain criteria, it's a talent-based visa, so you have to meet certain criteria like having a body of public-facing, impactful work, having won awards, having great recommendation letters. It's almost like applying to university, and it is decided on a case-by-case basis. You're essentially making a legal argument to the United States to let you work in the country because you are in the top 1% of your field, as they define it. It's not all that nebulous and subjective. And so that's like a major difference between the O and the H1B. But if you're on an employer-sponsored O, what happens if you lose your job is not that different from what would happen if you were on an H1B. In my case, I still had 60 days to find a new job, or get another visa, or leave the country.
BuzzFeed News was one of the brash new kids on the block in digital journalism. It even won a Pulitzer Prize. It was starting to get a little heft, a little recognition, and then, just like that, it didn't exist. Did you see this coming? Was there much notice or rumblings inside the company that they might shut the whole operation down?
I think the writing was on the wall. BuzzFeed was famously going through a lot of business issues. Everybody knew that the funding was drying up. They were not doing that well. The ad market in the digital space was absolutely brutal. And so they were dealing with a lot of business challenges. I have lost count of the number of rounds of layoffs that I have survived at BuzzFeed. I think starting all the way back in 2019 is when we had our first major round of layoffs, and then the pandemic hit. A lot of people got furloughed. I always managed to sort of escape, for the lack of a better word. I wasn't hit by the layoffs, the multiple rounds of layoffs that happened in that company. So there certainly were rumblings, and I think towards the end, morale was very low. In June 2022, right when I moved to the Bay Area and officially started working in the US, just a month before that, BuzzFeed pretty much gutted half of the newsroom. So I came back from my fellowship ready to start a brand new chapter at this company that was just being hollowed out in front of my eyes. We lost half the newsroom. We lost the investigations team. We lost the world team. We lost the politics team, which was crazy because BuzzFeed covered a lot of politics. And I lost my own team, which was the tech team. My editor and most of the rest of the team went over to another publication. And so I came here with sort of no newsroom, well, half the newsroom that it was, and none of the colleagues that I had spent the last 6 years working with, and essentially left to just figure out things on my own, which was not the most fun thing when you've just moved countries.
When the word finally came through that they were shutting everything down, you didn't have in common with many of your coworkers that you also faced being asked to leave the country. The clock starts ticking at that moment. Did you have a plan? Did you panic a little? How did it go?
Oh, I was absolutely devastated. It was funny because the writing was on the wall, and we had been told that the newsroom would be around at least till the end of December 2023. But the layoffs hit in the middle of April 2023. And so that was a bolt from the blue, because one day we woke up and opened our laptops, and there was an email from BuzzFeed founder and CEO Jonah Peretti saying that BuzzFeed News was shutting down. And so, yes, that was scary. And I didn't bother reading the rest of the email because I read the first couple of lines which said that we're beginning the process of closing down BuzzFeed News. And I just shut my laptop and sort of had to walk away and take a moment to breathe. It was stressful, but I was also thinking, hey, I have a body of impactful work. I've been a journalist for 15 years. I've won awards. Everybody knows my work. How hard can it be to get a new job? But that was the same time that the bottom fell out of the US media market. There were tons and tons of layoffs. Everybody was laying off. I believe Business Insider laid off people just a day before BuzzFeed shut down its newsroom. I remember sending messages to some friends who worked there saying, so sorry. And then one day later, they were messaging me back saying, oh, we are so sorry that your newsroom shut down. And so it was very hard to find a job, even though I ended up getting tons of interviews and many, many helpful leads.
There are many fewer American journalists who can call news reporting their full-time living and earn a regular staff salary with benefits and such than there used to be. I'm wondering whether American immigration law is subtle enough to take into account the difference between being a staff member and being a freelance. Can you be in the country long-term as a freelance?
So certainly on the O, you can do that. I mentioned that there's two ways to file an O visa. One is an employer files it for you and they become your petitioner, which essentially ties you to them and you can't work for anybody else. In that situation, no, you cannot freelance. You cannot earn any money except for whatever comes from your employer, who's your petitioner on your visa. But there's a second way to file an O, and it's called an agent-sponsored O. And I believe it has its roots in the entertainment industry, which is actually where a lot of O visas go. Let's say you're an aspiring actor, you want to work in films, you want to work in theater, and you're from a foreign country, you're not from the US, but you want to come to Hollywood. Acting is a gig. It's a gig job, right? Like you're not like an employee of a production house or a movie studio. You're essentially you're essentially getting paid per project, whether it's a movie, whether it's a TV show, or anything. And so the way you do this is you have your agent, because if you're an actor, you would have an agent. And then your agent is essentially your petitioner. And then the agent can file an O on your behalf. And what this means is that not only can you work for companies in your field who you have to get letters from, by the way, in the process of filing the visa, saying that you're going to work for them, but you can also do similar roles without informing the USCIS, which essentially frees you up to freelance, if that makes sense. So let's say you get letters from 2 movie studios saying, hey, we would like so-and-so actor to work on 5 projects with us over the next 3 years. You can do those projects. But if you are in the US and another movie studio approaches you, you don't have to refile your visa. You can just do those projects. And so that essentially lets you take on an unlimited number of projects on a freelance basis or even on a full-time basis in the US, as long as they're within your field of work. You can't come to the US on an O visa to be like an actor and then start working in engineering or something like that.
So you get let go along with the entire staff of BuzzFeed News. Was job one figuring out how to stay or staying employed? Because there's 2 masters that have to be served. The people that you pay your rent to and buy groceries from. And then there's the U.S. government who has to be okay with you staying too. Were you suddenly thrust into this world where you had to take care of a bunch of things at once?
Yeah, so I got lucky on this aspect because when BuzzFeed shut down its newsroom, the WARN Act kicked in because it was a major shutdown, and they essentially had to keep almost everyone in the newsroom on payroll for 90 days, which was good for me. They announced a shutdown in April 2023. And then they were dealing with the Buzzfeed News Union because we were unionized to figure out the terms of letting us go and severance and everything. And that took another few weeks to sort of hash out by the middle of May. And so the WARN Act kicked in after that, which meant that even though the newsroom had shut down, we were still on payroll till early August. And for me, I mean, it's great because everybody sort of got like a paid summer vacation. We were still getting our salaries till August. But for me personally, what that meant was my 60-day countdown clock didn't start until August because I was still on the company's payroll. The countdown clock starts once, like the day you get off a company's payroll. And so that gave me some time to breathe, get my thoughts together. And so one of the first things that I did was I started job hunting, and I spent the whole summer interviewing and applying to tons of places. A few things came close to working out, but there were also just like hundreds of unemployed journalists in the market. So everything was insanely competitive. And I was competing with American journalists who didn't have any visa issues. One of the things that an employer would have to do would be to sponsor a new O visa for me because my previous O visa was tied to Buzzfeed. That's an additional hurdle that a lot of employers generally do not want to deal with, especially if it's a choice between me and like 5 other American journalists. It's just less expense for them to hire somebody from here.
Sure, if you've applied for a job online in recent years, that question has featured more and more commonly on online job applications. Do you have to be sponsored? Are you a lawful permanent resident of the United States? They want to know what they're getting into. So was freelancing going to be your way forward because the other ways are just too complicated?
So towards the end of summer, I think I knew that I was on BuzzFeed's payroll till early August, and then I had 60 days to be in the country on that visa. I hit July and I started freaking out because you don't want to get to like the very end of those 60 days. You want to give yourself some time. I hit July, no jobs were working out, and I started freaking out. And so I activated my backup plan, which was to get one of the agent-sponsored O visas. It's a very flexible visa. Not that many people know about it, or not that many people know that you can also file an O in the second way through an agent. And so you don't need an employer to do it for you like you would if your employer is your petitioner, which meant that I could apply for it independently as long as I could find an agent. And then I also had to get lots of letters from media companies saying that they would let me freelance for them, which was a lot of hustling that I had to do. I basically activated all my networks in the US media. Luckily, because I worked at BuzzFeed News, I knew a lot of people in the US press, and they all knew me. And so most people were extremely happy to give me letters saying that they would let me freelance for them. And so I got a handful of these letters, and then I had to find a new lawyer who would be willing to file this visa for me at a reasonable price. I had to get an agent, but I was really lucky to sort of get all these things together in literally 10 days. It was filed. I got the new visa end of July. And then in August, I was able to start freelancing because my new visa was in place.
Did you know all of this, or did you have to quickly get up to speed on some of the intricacies of the law? American immigration law can sometimes be devilishly complicated.
Yeah, it helped that I had already been through the O process with BuzzFeed News before. So I was more or less familiar with how it worked. What I wasn't familiar with was how do I get all these letters from all these publications saying that they would let me freelance for them, because I didn't need to do that the first time around because it was just my employer, BuzzFeed, doing it. And so they just said, we want to hire this person and we want to sponsor his O, and he's going to be working with us in this role. And here are his responsibilities. He's going to be covering tech. So it was all very comfortable and didn't need a lot of work on my end. But the second agent-sponsored O visa, I had to do a fair amount of running around and frantically emailing everybody I knew in the media. And most people are very understanding and very nice about it. I did run into some roadblocks, but more often than not, people were nice.
Had you entertained the possibility of really having to go home and heading back to India?
I didn't want to think about it, honestly, because in some ways, I think that would have been the easiest thing to do, right? It was trying to stay here was very stressful, extremely anxiety inducing. I think I still don't sleep properly at night because of like the trauma from that time. And so packing my bags and going back to India would have been very comfortable. I would have been home. I wouldn't have had to worry about visas or anything. But I just got here. I hadn't even been in the country for like 2 years at that point. And so I felt like I had to give it a fair shot and I had to fight it out a little bit, despite the broken system and all the stress and the expense and the anxiety. I didn't want to just let it go so easily because most people don't get to be here. When people go to all kinds of lengths to get into this country, whether it legally or illegally, I felt that this was one battle that I shouldn't shy away from.
Now that you've been through this, do you look back at the people you covered when you were writing about the tech layoffs in Silicon Valley and understand them in a different way?
I certainly know a lot more now about what it is like to actually be in their shoes that I didn't know when I was just reporting on them because I hadn't been laid off before and then I was. I have a new sort of appreciation and understanding of the anxieties that legal immigrants in the US go to, just having been through it on my own now.
Has it had an impact on your thinking about the sort of midterm and long future? Are you now thinking about the United States as a long-term home? Are you in process of trying to figure out what it would take to be a lawful permanent resident, to be someone who's made a commitment to be here for the long haul?
Yes, certainly. I think going through this has certainly made me more resilient. I feel like if I figured it out once, I can do it again. There's a lot more confidence now. I know how the system works a little bit better. Unfortunately, being a legal permanent resident of the US is not easy, especially if you're from a country like India or China. The US allows, I think, 140,000 green cards, employment based green cards every year, but it doesn't allow more than 7% of each year's green cards per country, which means that if you happen to be born in India and China, you are placed on a massive green card backlog. For Indians right now, it's literally more than 100 years. This is not an exaggeration. If you are from India and if you file for a green card today, you're literally not going to get it for 100 years, which is basically like never.
Well, it's an incentive to take better care of yourself anyway.
Right. You can try and be as fit as possible, and then maybe when you're 99 years old, you'll get a green card, and then you'll just die with your green card in your hand, and then at that point, it's like, what is the point? But this country makes it very hard to be here legally, and this is a debate I think that is just glossed about in all the contentious debates about immigration and illegal immigration that happen in the US and are now big election issues. But I don't think anybody pays attention to the problems of legal immigration and how broken it is, especially if you are from India or China. It's a completely broken system. And as a result of having been through this, I've just started reading more closely about immigration and the problems associated with it. And I'm in all these like forums, and there's lots of like Slack communities, and there's a lot of people advocating for change and reform to legal immigration in the US because it is just so hard to be here legally. Most people who want to be here don't want to just be here to like make it their permanent home in many cases. I know a lot of people from India who've been here like 20 years and 25 years and who still don't have green cards and have no intention of staying here in their old age. They all want to go back to India. And a lot of people just want that green card because Getting a green card guarantees like some amount of stability in the country. You don't have to go back if you lose your job, for instance. And so that's the reason why most people want green cards, not because they want to just like take over the US and stay here like permanently.
Well, you hear, and as someone who's paying attention to this, I'm sure you've heard Americans say something along the lines of, I don't mind if you want to be an immigrant as long as you do it the right way and get on the back of the line. Well, you just told us the back of the line is in the middle of the 22nd century.
Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, most Americans don't know how broken the legal immigration system is. And I don't blame them. Look, I'm from India. I have no idea how India's immigration system functions. I'm sure we have all kinds of roadblocks and hurdles that make it very hard for people to stay in our country. And so on one level, I don't blame Americans for not knowing how the system works. But also, like, America makes such loud noises about how friendly it is to immigrants, and it's like it's a country of immigrants. Like, that's like the whole brand. It's like people from all over the world come here and they can live the American dream and have their like dreams and aspirations come true, and they can be anybody they want. And that's just not. It's weird because that's as a legal as I'm not even an immigrant because I'm still on a visa, right? I'm not on a green card, but like as someone who's trying to be here legally, that's just not true because America makes it so hard for you to be here legally to begin with, and you don't. I mean, you see all these stories about all the illegal immigrants and people trying to cross the border and enter this country by any way possible. But even coming here legally is so challenging and so expensive that it's a lose-lose situation. And I don't know how it will be fixed unless there's some massive reform that only the Congress can initiate, which they have not.
Pranav Dixit. He's a journalist, a Nieman Fellow, and one of the casualties of the end of Buzzfeed News. He joined us from Silicon Valley. Great to talk to you, Pranav.
So good to talk to you. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.